Welcome back to Talk the Walk. With me now is David Firestein, President and CEO of the Bush China Foundation. He's also a U.S. diplomat serving in the U.S. State Department before. Thank you very much for joining us, David.
Thank you.
Now let's take a look at the United States under the Trump administration's policy in Asia Pacific. Now, as we know, outgoing Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has lifted the self-imposed restrictions regarding exchanges with Taiwan. How did the act sabotage the tradition of strategic ambivalence in U.S.-Taiwan interactions? And what actual impact does that have on the dynamics in the Asia-Pacific region?
Well, I think this move by Secretary Pompeo coming, again, just a few days before the end of the administration is really a symbolic gesture. It is much more dramatic at the level of symbolism than it is at the level of actual impact on present or future U.S. policy. For one thing, his reversal of the guidelines on Taiwan or U.S. contact with Taiwan can easily be completely reversed on January 20th if the Biden administration sees fit to do that. I think that this is just another example of the Trump administration trying to make a splash, do something that seems dramatic, do something that would seem to hem in the Biden administration. But the reality, if you look closely at what was said, and if you look closely at the action that Secretary Pompeo described in his statement of a few days ago, it really is more bark than bite. It's not something that changes anything in a real sense on a day-to-day basis today, tomorrow, the next day. And it's something that, in any case, the Biden administration will reevaluate as it sees fit. And ultimately, the Biden administration will engage with Taiwan in the way that it sees fit to engage with Taiwan. Mm-hmm. The Biden administration is not going to take marching orders from Secretary of State Pompeo. And I think it's notable. A couple of things are notable about this, Sarah. Number one, the Secretary himself opted not to travel to Taiwan, which would have been certainly seen as an incendiary action on the part by China. The U.S. ambassador to the United Nations ended up evidently canceling her plans to visit Taiwan.
That's
right. At one point, that was something that was planned. And if you look at Secretary Pompeo's statement, he never refers to Taiwan as a, quote, country. Everything he says, every noun he uses, every adjective he uses, is all within the constraints of the policy that he says he's doing away with. So even as he says we're getting rid of this notion of strictures around our engagement with Taiwan, he himself in his very language gives expression to that policy. And I think it kind of makes a mockery of this action and shows it for what it really is. It's kind of a last-ditch attempt to do something that seems dramatic, but that actually has very little effect on the relationship.
Interesting. Now, David, as you said, the Biden administration is certainly not taking order from Secretary Pompeo, but the Biden administration is expected to largely follow in the footsteps of the Obama administration's foreign policy. Now, we take a look at Biden's cabinet picks. Now, Biden tapped Kurt Campbell as the Assistant Secretary of State specializing in Asia-Pacific affairs. Now, Campbell has vowed to maintain a strong relationship with Taiwan because of its profound significance. The Taiwan representatives to the United States also congratulated Campbell on his appointment. What does that tell us about the future U.S.-Taiwan policies under a new Biden administration?
Well, I think at a broad level, the first point that I would make is that, as with Mr. Campbell, so many of the top-level leaders who have been designated to be cabinet secretaries and senior officials in the incoming Biden administration are officials who served in senior capacities in the Obama administration, whether that's Tony Blinken, who's the incoming Secretary of State, John Kerry, the former Secretary of State, who's the incoming kind of climate czar within the State Department, presidential envoy, Samantha Powers, who's going to be heading up the U.S. Agency for International Development, Bill Burns, who's going to be heading up the CIA, and right down the line, Jake Sullivan, who's going to be the National Security Advisor. Every one of these people served in senior and comparable positions in the Obama administration. And so I think we see a lot of the same personnel at the very top levels and a level or two down from the cabinet levels. And therefore, it portends to me that we will likely see a substantial degree of continuity relative to the Obama-Biden administration's approach to the world. That being said, it is also true that the overall context in which foreign policy is conducted, and certainly in which China policy is formulated and conducted, has changed. And so I think that will represent a constraint on the Biden administration. But overall, I think we're seeing a lot of the same people. Biden himself was the vice president, obviously, when Barack Obama was president. And a lot of these senior people are people directly from that administration. And I think what we're going to see is, over time, a reversion to a number of the Obama-era policies, whether it's with respect to Taiwan specifically, whether it's with respect to climate, whether it's with respect to Iran, for example, Russia, and right down the line. So I don't think we're going to see too many surprises when it comes to the Biden administration's approach to foreign policy. And I do think we will see some continuity in some regards with respect to policies that have been put in place during the last 4 years. But over time, I do think we will see movement back toward a somewhat less ideological and more moderate positioning in a number of areas with respect to U.S.-China relations and more generally.
Now let's take a look at another geopolitical hotspot, which is Indo-Pacific. Now you mentioned the nomination for National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and definitely important Secretary of State Antony Blinken. They're both foreign policy veterans in Washington, D.C., and both Sullivan and Blinken played a crucial role in forging a strategy to rebalance the power dynamics in the Asia-Pacific. What does that tell us about a broader pattern in future U.S. engagement in Indo-Pacific, especially with India?
Well, I think it's a great question, and you're absolutely right that Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan and others were quite deeply involved in setting policy, foreign policy, or certainly advising the president on foreign policy, including the pivot to Asia, as it was initially referred to, later referred to as the rebalancing to Asia. The construct that came out of the Trump administration early on was the notion of kind of a renaming or reframing of the region as the Indo-Pacific, and bringing India more into the fabric of what the United States was seeking to do in Asia, including the establishment of what's referred to as the Quad.
And
the United States
China influence, more importantly.
Exactly, and with the idea of countering China's influence and kind of serving as a bulwark against that. But that being said, the essentials of the Trump administration's overall approach to Asia and to the Asia-Pacific, I think, are not particularly discernibly different from the Obama administration's. And I think we're going to, continue to see now that we're on the cusp of the Biden administration. I think we're going to see a sense that the Asia-Pacific region, whatever term is used for it, whether it's Indo-Pacific or Asia-Pacific, is the single most important region to the United States from the standpoint of trade, investment, business, and prosperity. It's with that in mind that I think that the Biden administration is going to look at free trade arrangements such as the Trans-Pacific Partnership and other similar arrangements in the East Asian region differently as we go forward than the Trump administration did. I think that fundamentally the Biden administration is going to be much more of a free trade advocate than in the classical sense of the term as we've defined it in the United States than the Trump administration was. And so I think we will see continued focus on Asia, not just to counter China per se, that is an element of U.S. strategy, but also simply because the Asian region as a whole is vitally important to our nation's prosperity and security.
So while the United States is busy with the transition of power, China also have some moves in Southeast Asia. Now, Foreign Minister Wang Yi has embarked upon a week-long trip to Southeast Asia, including stops in Myanmar and the Philippines. Now, will a revigorated China-Philippines alliance challenge any U.S. interest in Southeast Asia? Quick thoughts.
Well, I don't think so. I mean, the relationship between China and the Philippines is somewhat complicated. Sometimes it's positive, sometimes it's negative. The Philippines is obviously one of the claimants in the South China Sea. There's been a lot of friction over the last several years around that. The Philippines is an ally of the United States, though sometimes it doesn't feel that way, but it is a treaty ally of the United States. And so I don't think many in the United States are too worried about some type of enhancement of a China-Philippines relationship. There are some limitations to where that relationship can go because of the long-standing disputes between those two nations and others around the South China Sea. And bottom line is, I don't think anyone worries too much about a kind of China-Philippines access, particularly given that the Philippines remains a treaty ally of the United States.
All right, David, thank you very much for joining us. It's great to have you with us. And for all of those who are watching, I'll see you next week right here on Talk to Walk. Stay tuned.